What do a penny stock from Calgary, a helicopter over the Borneo jungle, and a pile of river gold have in common? One fraud at the center of all of it. And before it was over, it had fooled the entire mining world. Bre-X Minerals announced the largest gold discovery in history. The discovery contained almost no gold at all. The stock hit $280 a share. The company was worth $6 billion. And then, in the space of a few weeks in the spring of 1997, every cent of that vanished. Pension funds wiped out. Retail investors ruined. The man who knew the most about how it worked fell from a helicopter into the Bornean rainforest before he could tell anyone. Nobody has ever been convicted. This is the story of how a hole in the ground in East Kalimantan became the biggest mining fraud in history, and how it collapsed so completely it left almost no evidence and almost no justice behind it. David Walsh was not, by any measure, a man the market expected much from. He was a former stockbroker based in Calgary, carrying significant personal debt, and by 1988, he had incorporated a small exploration company called Bre-X Minerals. For years, it traded as a penny stock. No meaningful discoveries, no reason to pay attention. The kind of company that exists in the margins of the junior mining world, where almost everyone is chasing something they will never find. Then, in 1993, a Dutch-born geologist named John Felderhof told Walsh about a remote property in East Kalimantan, on the island of Borneo in Indonesia, called Busang. Felderhof was a veteran prospector, the kind of man whose opinion carried weight in the industry. Walsh acquired exploration rights. A Filipino geologist named Michael de Guzman was brought in as project manager on the ground, and drilling began. For 2 years, nothing dramatic happened publicly. But in October 1995, Bre-X announced an initial resource estimate at Busang of roughly 30 million ounces of gold. To put that in context, a discovery of that size would already rank among the most significant finds in decades. The stock began to climb. What happened through 1996 is the part that, in retrospect, should have raised more questions faster. Press release after press release pushed the Busang estimate upward. 30 million ounces became 60, then 70, then past 100 million ounces. Analysts who covered the stock publicly speculated the real figure could reach 200 million ounces, which would have made Busang by far the largest gold deposit ever found anywhere on Earth. The stock, which had traded for pennies, reached approximately 280 Canadian dollars per share. The market capitalization of this small Calgary exploration company hit around 6 billion Canadian dollars. Institutional investors, fund managers, and tens of thousands of ordinary Canadians poured money in. The story was extraordinary. And that, it turns out, was the problem. Here is how drilling for gold is supposed to work, and how the fraud worked instead. When miners drill into the earth, they pull up cylindrical cores of rock from deep underground. Those cores get crushed, and the crushed material is sent to an assay laboratory, where chemists measure precisely how much gold is present per ton of rock. The lab result determines whether there is a real deposit worth mining. At Busang, the core samples were returning consistently rich, rising, extraordinary gold grades from a deposit that Strathcona Mineral Services, the independent auditing firm that ultimately investigated the site, would later conclude did not meaningfully exist. The reason the labs kept reporting gold was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. Gold was being added to the crushed core material after it came out of the ground, but before it reached the laboratory. Lab after lab, assay after assay, all they saw was the gold that had been introduced into the sample. They had no way to know it had not come from the rock. The gold used for salting was alluvial, meaning it had been panned from nearby rivers rather than extracted from hard rock. That distinction matters forensically, because alluvial gold has been tumbled by water over long periods. Its grains are rounded and smooth. Gold found naturally in hard rock deposits has angular, jagged grains. When Strathcona's investigators finally got access to the samples in 1997, the rounded grains were one of the forensic signatures that told them immediately what had happened. The fraud had operated undetected for years. For one simple reason, no independent party had been allowed to drill their own verification holes at Busang. Every number came from samples handled by de Guzman's team on the ground. There was no external check. Until there was. So far, Bre-X has built a $6 billion company on a deposit that does not exist, and nobody outside the Busang site has any idea. What happens next is where the whole structure starts to crack under its own weight. By late 1996, Busang had become so valuable on paper that it attracted the attention of people who had real power in Indonesia. The children of President Suharto, one of the most powerful figures in Southeast Asia, were drawn into the scramble. His son Bambang Trihatmojo's interests were linked to one of the competing consortium bids for the Busang stake. His daughter Siti Hardianti Rukmana, known as Tutut, was brought into a competing partnership bid. Indonesia's mining ministry reshuffled the arrangements and ultimately forced Bre-X into a joint venture agreement that handed American mining giant Freeport-McMoRan operating rights at the site, along with something Bre-X had never granted any outside party before, the right to conduct its own independent verification drilling. Freeport's team arrived at Busang in early 1997 and began drilling. In February of that year, Bre-X had raised its official claimed resource to approximately 71 million ounces, and analysts were still talking about 200 million. Then on 17 March 1997, Michael de Guzman boarded a helicopter at Samarinda, headed for the Busang site, where Freeport's verification team was already at work. 2 days later, on 19 March, de Guzman fell from the helicopter into the jungle below, from an altitude reported at between 800 and 1,000 feet. A body was recovered 4 days later in the dense rainforest, severely decomposed and largely consumed by insects and animals. Indonesian authorities officially ruled the death a suicide, citing notes said to have been recovered. But the identification itself, the notes, and the manner of death were publicly disputed for years afterward. Multiple women in the Philippines came forward, each claiming to have been de Guzman's wife. The precise truth of what happened on that helicopter has never been established to anyone's satisfaction. Rumors spread almost immediately that Freeport's independent drilling was finding almost nothing where Bre-X had reported world record concentrations. Bre-X shares dropped sharply and trading was halted. The man who knew most about the sample handling at Busang was dead, and the auditors were already reading the results. On 4 May 1997, Strathcona Mineral Services released its report. The conclusion was unambiguous. The Bre-X core samples had been tampered with on a scale Strathcona described as unprecedented in the history of mining. Alluvial gold, identifiable by its rounded water-worn grains, had been added to the crushed core material before assay. There was no economic gold deposit at Busang. The 71 million ounces, the 100 million ounces, the speculation about 200 million, every figure Bre-X had ever reported, none of it was real. Bre-X stock collapsed to effectively zero within days. Around 6 billion Canadian dollars in market value was erased. Pension funds took severe losses. Retail investors across Canada, people who had bought in at the height of the excitement, lost life savings. David Walsh died of a brain aneurysm in the Bahamas in 1998, never having been charged with any offense. John Felderhof, who had sold roughly 84 million Canadian dollars worth of Bre-X shares before the collapse, was charged by the Ontario Securities Commission with insider trading. After what became one of the longest trials in Ontario history, he was acquitted of all charges in 2007. No individual has ever been criminally convicted for the gold salting fraud at Busang. With de Guzman dead, and the chain of responsibility at the sample handling level never established in court, the precise mechanics of who did what and who knew what remained, legally speaking, unresolved. The Bre-X fraud did eventually produce changes in how the mining industry validates resource estimates, including the introduction of stricter independent verification requirements in Canada. But for the investors who held shares in May 1997, those reforms arrived several years too late. The jungle at Busang still has no meaningful gold in it. The $6 billion is still gone. And the question that nobody has ever fully answered is exactly how many people knew. If you had been a retail investor in 1996 watching a Calgary penny stock turn into what every analyst was calling the gold discovery of the century, the pressure to buy in would have been real. The institutions were in. The brokers were calling. The numbers kept going up. So here is the question I want you to sit with. At what point would you have started asking how no independent geologist had ever drilled their own holes at Busang? What would it have taken for you to say, the story is too good, and walk away? Leave your answer in the comments, because the psychology of why smart people believed this is one of the most instructive parts of the whole story. If you want more documentaries like this one, subscribe. There is a lot more to come,